It's time now to call on a great association with the Kessel Peace Institute. They're a student faculty association dedicated for working for peace in our community, our country, and our world. So Justin Biel is now the new director of the Kessel Peace Institute, and he's traveled all the way from Mankato to speak to us today to tell us about just what the Kessel Peace Institute does currently and how they see the future. And if the young people are getting behind us and working for peace and justice. Justin Biel.
Thanks, Phil. Everybody able to hear me okay? All right. I will do a little bit of telling you about what we're up to and how we see the future. But I'm a historian, so I have a story to tell. I guess to give away the moral of it, it goes along pretty well with what we've been hearing. Consciousness raising is worth it. And sometimes the unintended but beneficial effects are the worth it part. And also pay attention to the year that I mentioned a couple of times here, 1958. So, all right, with that, as Bill said, my name is Justin Biel, and I'm the current director of the Kessel Peace Institute at Minnesota State Mankato. The Kessel Institute is a coalition of students and faculty members who administer and work with an endowment that's honoring the legacy of a former colleague, Abbas Kessel. He was a professor in the political science department at Minnesota State Mankato for 19 years and a lifelong peace activist. Accordingly, we are proud that we're a partial sponsor of this Peacestock gathering. This is my first. Thank you so much for doing this in the fall. What a treat to drive from Mankato to Red Wing today. Absolutely beautiful. Let me read a couple of lines from the mission statement of the Kessel Institute, and then I'll explain their relevance to my talk. The Institute defines peace in its broadest sense, denoting not only the absence of conflict, but also the interrelationship of the factors necessary to create or enhance harmony within and among human beings and their environments. The Institute affirms Abbas Kessel's insistence that for peace to be possible, the values, behaviors, and conditions essential for positive human relations must exist at multiple levels: personal, local, regional, national, and international. So my corner of the academic work done at MSU Mankato is as a historian of Britain and of modern Europe. My own area of expertise in British history is a little earlier, the 18th and 19th centuries, but I want to talk about one of the more remarkable developments and movements to emerge in Britain in the last 100 years, and that was Britain's campaign for nuclear disarmament, the CND. This formally came into existence in 1958. And I feel some affinity for this movement because several of its leading members in the early days and also in the 1980s were British historians, my predecessors. And not just any British historians, some of the very best writers, most talented writers that my field of study has ever produced. What I want to relay, though, in talking about this group's activism is the sense in which, from an early date, it expressed values worth having for what the Kessel Peace Institute describes as positive human relations to exist. There are many, but the two values that I'll focus on, probably not all that surprising, but maybe underappreciated as part of the ethos of nuclear disarmament. Those two values are ecocentrism and the suspension of distrust. A little background about marches. As I mentioned, the CND began in Britain in 1958. It formed around organizing a march, originally from London to Aldermaston, a city about 50 miles west, town about 50 miles west of London. Aldermaston was the site of Britain's atomic weapons research establishment. The march became an annual event, but after the first year, the organizers of the CND reversed the direction. They realized that if you started in Aldermaston and marched into the center of London, Trafalgar Square, it would attract more publicity and more media attention. And this is indeed what happened. The growth of the CND is a pretty phenomenal story between 1958 and 1962. So this is before the Cuban Missile Crisis. There had been earlier demonstrations, kind of ad hoc ones, carried out at the Aldermaston facility, but the annual CND marches were continual and they were popular. By the fourth march in 1961, there were 450 local branches of the organization and 150,000 participants in the march. And that made the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament Britain's largest political pressure group after the Second World War that wasn't itself a political party. So it was a rapid rise. Now, what was it that the CND was campaigning for exactly? I think you'll find this interesting. They wanted, organizers wanted, Britain to unilaterally give up nuclear weapons and also to withdraw from the NATO alliance. I think that latter part is really important because if you think about this in the 1950s, one could imagine a scenario in which giving up nuclear weapons for Britain or by British people would have been sort of an easy choice, right? They could have said, we can comfortably shelter under the nuclear umbrella of the United States and put our tax pounds into things like schools and houses. But the commitment to disarming and asserting neutrality, or the language that they often used, non-alignment, tells you that this was a protest movement against the Cold War framework, right? And that they wanted to find ways to put pressure on both the United States and Soviet Union to draw down the Cold War tensions and ultimately to draw down their nuclear arsenals too. So I'll come back to this a little later, but one of the founding members of the CND was the then octogenarian philosopher Bertrand Russell. And he wrote a really beautiful defense of the position of neutrality in addition to disarmament. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. First, let me just highlight the ecocentrism or ecologism that in some way the CND helped to foster in the 1960s in Britain. Jody Burkett is the current scholar who has studied the CND's evolution most closely, and she's identified ecocentrism as a value that this organization should get a little more credit for expounding and exuding. I find her argument pretty persuasive, and so I'll try to share the outlines of it with you, but something to just think about temporally is that it's pretty common for historians to talk about how in the 1960s the photos being captured by the Apollo space missions, the photos that showed the Earth as a beautiful but kind of whole system that humans were within rather than apart from. Historians talk about that very commonly as a pivotal moment in the rise of modern environmentalism. And there's no doubt, these photos did make it quite possible for people to visualize the Earth as a system, and by extension humans as dependent on the health of that system. You know, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Westerners in particular had gotten accustomed to kind of thinking of themselves as apart from nature and the earth, and thinking of nature and the earth as machine-like, manipulable, in order to produce human ends. And that, obviously, that attitude to nature is still part of everyday consciousness, but there has been a rising tide of awareness since the 1960s that we're not exempt from what happens to our environment, right? What a careful study of the CND's publications and kind of public positions in the 1960s will show is that the way in which they discussed nuclear weapons as a threat also did some of this work of preparing people, their constituents especially, for thinking of us humans all as dependent on our physical environment. This was not just because it suddenly became apparent that huge areas of the globe could become radioactive fallout zones in a relative blink of the eye. It was also that, and this is where Jody Burkett's argument is impressive, it was also that the notion of a nuclear war, think about the relevance, the notion of a nuclear war made remote war, a war in which two sides of the world were involved but had no physical meeting place in the middle, conceivable in a new way, right? So the world shrank, essentially. And not just in physical, spatial terms, but also in terms of time. Because in a way, and the CND representations of what a nuclear war would entail kind of highlight this, they implied a new kind of simultaneity. So clearly, nuclear devastation wasn't something that would happen at the exact same time in different locations, but it would happen on the same time scale. A blink of an eye is the way that this came across, right? So this was another way in which the CND publicity about the threat of a nuclear war suggested, at the limit of things, that there were massive equivalences in the environmental dependency of humans. A key thing that I want to just point out is that I'm not saying that we should give thanks that nuclear weapons put us in touch with our dependence on Earth and on each other. The point is rather that it took people like those involved in the CND movement talking about the threat of nuclear warfare to induce this kind of shift in ecological thinking. And one of the things that I really didn't know a whole lot about until looking into this movement's history was just how slowly the publics in nuclear-armed nations like Britain and the United States acquired information about nuclear warfare. And I confess, I don't know as much about this on the US side of the Atlantic, but in Britain, the government tried to keep information about its atomic weapons development projects pretty much out of the news. And quite remarkably, you can look at the mainstream newspaper press from 1954 to 1945 to 1954, and you will see that there is almost no coverage of nuclear weapons in British newspapers during those years. And of course, the main radio and television outlets in Great Britain during this time period were the BBC, so it was a little easier for the UK government to restrain what appeared on those channels. So this made the work of envisioning or of publicizing what exactly nuclear warfare might involve especially crucial, the work that the CND members did by constantly talking about the threat. It wasn't, I should just finish that line of thought, it was only once the news broke in 1954 and 1955 of the Soviet Union and the United States testing hydrogen bombs, that more press coverage in Britain began to focus on the issue of nuclear weapons and the destruction that they could cause. And then, of course, short space of time, the British began testing their own hydrogen bomb in 1957, which amplified concerns about just the dangers of the tests themselves. But just as an additional iteration of this point, that the British government remained highly ambivalent about releasing information to the public on nuclear weaponry and nuclear warfare. There was a documentary, or a docudrama, we could call it, an imagined scenario film that was made for BBC television in 1965 called The War Game. It was a depiction of what a nuclear war between the superpowers would look like. However, before it aired, the BBC management decided to pull it from screening on television. It made appearances at film festivals in the fall of 1965, winter of 1966, but it didn't ever reach the mass audience that it would have by way of the television. 10 years later, in 1975, when the membership in the campaign for nuclear disarmament was flagging, one of the ways that the group started to reach out to a new generation of activists was to sponsor screenings of the war game, particularly on college campuses or university campuses, and expressly as a consciousness-raising technique. Okay, there's a lot more that could be said about the CND in the late Cold War years. You may know that the current British Prime Minister Liz Truss has early memories of going to CND demonstrations with her parents. Her father was a mathematician and university professor. Her mother was a nurse. And they sang anti-Margaret Thatcher songs at those rallies routinely. And now, if you've been paying attention to news from Great Britain, she seems to be trying out a rerun of Thatcher's trickle-down economic philosophy at present. So that set of issues aside, there is an ethos I would wish that Truss and others would recall that trickled instead down through the CND over the years. In 1962, Bertrand Russell wrote an article called "The Case for British Nuclear Disarmament." And within the article, this is in a section called "A Job for Neutrals." He wrote, "Whatever preferences an individual may feel for capitalism or communism, as the case may be, he can best serve mankind by remembering that the conflict between the two is much worse than either. And that in the service of humanity, the best thing that any of us can do is to mitigate the acerbity of the conflict. Some think communism evil, some think capitalism evil, but neither is as evil as the belief of each that the other is evil." Obviously, the unspoken thing that made the conflict between the two sides potentially so much worse than the coexistence of them was the nuclear threat. But even absent the nuclear factor, as a principle of peace activism, or as, again to put it in line with the Kessel Peace Institute's mission, as a value essential for positive human relations, that closing phrase, I think, really resonates. Neither is as evil as the belief that the other is evil. To me, right, this says that the belief that the other has it in for me just doesn't serve. Or at least, if I'm going to protest frankly and not cynically, I have to suspend my disbelief that my personhood doesn't matter to my opponent. I think this is a tough call to heed, and especially in the face of evidence to the contrary. And yet, we must in order to de-escalate. So thank you very much.
Great to have Justin here in the Kessel Peace Institute. We want to continue our relationship with them and our future Peacestocks. And maybe we were supposed to have a live event in Mankato Sibley Park a year ago, but the COVID came back and we had to scrap that to an online program. But hopefully we can get over to Mankato again and have another Peacestock over there. Get the students involved.